Hi Edit, here is the feedback for the mock exam that you did just before Christmas. You scored 3 out of 4 for this first question because B is not a true answer. Jay Rayner wasn't really happy to help his son with his homework because he knew he'd struggled at school. The other correct answer should have been he makes a joke to cover up his own real exam results. But 3 out of 4 is a good start. So if we move on to look at question 2, which asks you to write a summary of the differences between Eddie and Henry. You make a good start by saying that they're treated differently and then go on to give us some interesting details about Eddie. He lives at home with his family and asking his father for help. You also say that Eddie has more spare time, he feels comfortable at home and he has his own little room where he can play on his computer with his friends. But you've not really given any quotes to back up those points or examples from the text that tell you about this. You have included some quotes, but they're not really relevant to the points that you're making. You mentioned here that Jay feels a bit sad and starts to think, why is his son so good, irritatingly good? You need to expand on that and say why he's irritatingly good. It's the fact that everything seems to come naturally to him. He doesn't seem to need to work hard at his work. It just annoyingly happens that he's good at it. When we move on to Henry, you say he's unhappy, he's away from his family, can't wait to see them at Christmas. He's begging his father to let him come home. You think he's over-exaggerating. I think you're quite right. You could have gone into more detail about why Henry feels it's so bad there. You could have given more detail about the different attitudes towards the parents. The fact that Eddie makes fun of his dad but seems to have a fun, loving relationship with him, whereas Henry's very polite to his dad and it could seem to be being scared of him. It's a distant relationship because he's not seen him for 2 years, so it can't be that close, although it could imply that he's missing him as well. The fact that he says the father wants to rely more on the truth of George's story suggests that he's suspicious of Henry's motives in writing such an emotive letter to him. If we look at the mark scheme for level 2, it says that you should show some interpretation from one or both texts and attempt some influence from one or both texts. Well, I think you've offered some inference, which is where you're reading between the lines and trying to identify what the writer's telling you without actually saying it in words. You've used some appropriate references and textual detail from one or both texts, but I think you could have done more that were actually relevant to the points that you were making in answer to the question. And you have given statements to show some differences between the texts. So I think we need to stay at level 2 for this one, but I think it's worth the 4 out of 8 marks for this question. If you'd gone into greater depth and mentioned some of the things that I've spoken about before, that would have got you up into the band 3 and given you higher marks. Okay, moving on to question 3, where you're asked to analyse the language that Henry uses to try to influence his father. You start off well. You say he's trying to get his father to be sorry for him, complaining. He's very polite and respectful. The good use of the terminology here uses the adjective unhappy to describe his whole situation. And then again you go on and say he also uses meet again alive if God permit to exaggerate the situation, which is a good example of the language used. And you say that he's trying to persuade his father about his poor life in school, which is a good point. He's trying to persuade him to let him come home, isn't he? And then the final quote here, all his life be there. Oh, sorry, he would rather be obliged to work all his life than be in there. So it said, you've said that he feels like a slave being there. So you could have given the quote where he compares himself to a bear, more like a bear than a Christian, which would have been a good example of a simile. You've not given any analysis of the language terminology here, so you could have said that he uses emotive language in that little quote there. So if we look at the mark scheme for level 2, it says shows some understanding of language, attempts to comment on the effect of the language. Well, you've done that. Select some appropriate textual detail. Again, you've done that. You've chosen some good quotes. And make some use of subject terminology, mainly appropriately. You've made some use of the terminology, and where you've used it, it is accurate. So I think we've covered all of the level 2 criteria there. So let's just have a little look at level 3. Explains clearly the effects of the writer's choice of language. I think you needed to go into a little bit more detail really to cover that bullet point. Selects a range of relevant textual detail and makes clear and accurate use of subject terminology. I think you're there or thereabouts, so I think possibly if we go for the bottom end of level 3 with a mark of 7 out of the 12, because with it being a 12-mark question, you need to include at least 4 points with examples, mentions of the terminology, and then a description of how that's trying to influence the father. You have given several good examples, so you've met most of the criteria. To have gained higher marks, I think if you'd have explained in a little bit more detail of how he's trying to influence his father or persuade his father that he wants to come home. For example, you could have said he uses repetition of my dear father to try and get over to his father how he misses him, how he holds him dear. But on the other hand, you could say that it could be a deliberate ploy by Henry to use that language because they've not seen each other for 2 years while he's been at boarding school, so obviously the father doesn't think that highly of him. So it could be just him trying to get round him, trying to pull on his heartstrings. You would also need to make sure that you use the terminology, language terminology, for each point that you're making to gain the higher marks. But all in all, 7 out of 12 is a good score, so well done. Moving on to question 4, where you've been asked to compare how the two writers convey their different attitudes to parenting and education. Well done for working out what the question is actually asking you to do, and use the second letter in the Henry saga, where the father has written to the family friend. Not many people did pick up on this point. So you started off by saying it's a really big difference between the two parents, and one of them, good point, has everyday contact with his son, but the other one doesn't. We could have done with an example there, really. And then you go on to explain Jay's attitude towards his education and towards his Eddie's abilities. Until he blames himself because he can't think, and you've picked up on well that it was hard for him to admit that he wasn't able to help him with the metaphor. Again, you've picked up on the fact, reading between the lines, that he's disappointed that you couldn't help him, but he was also proud of the level of his son's ability, and uses irritatingly and clever to describe him. So it's the fact that it seems to come so easily to Eddie, doesn't it? He doesn't seem to have to work very hard at it. Okay, so that's there you go. You've gone on to about this understanding and non-understanding about maths. And then the fact that at the end he goes in and is nice and respectful to his son because, you know, he's had it pointed out to him again with his exam results how clever he is. He is so much more clever than his father. And I think from that we can understand that Jay does value education. Then for the second one, we focused more on the relationship rather than the education. We said that he couldn't speak to his sons face to face, and he's asking for help because, again, a good point, he doesn't know about his son's feeling, he can't trust what's written in the letter, so he's got his suspicions about Henry, which is why he wants Mr. Smith, no, not Mr. Smith, the family friend, to speak to them, and also to speak to George. As you say, he wants to speak to them in person, or if not, if the family friend could speak to them. Again, you've picked up on the fact that Eddie is quite cheeky and fun with his father because he makes fun of him, and you've used the quote, "You can't think of one, can you?" So he's using a rhetorical question there. And then Henry, again, you've picked up on that he's trying every different method he can to persuade his father to let him come home. You've picked up on the point that they act differently in this way, where Henry's dad's first thought is to try and get to the bottom of the truth, try and help his sons if they need it. So again, if we look at the mark scheme for level 2, it says attempts to compare ideas and perspectives. Well, you've done that. You've done some lovely comparisons there of their ideas and perspectives. Make some comments on how the writer's methods are used. Now, this is the one that you're lacking a little bit. You've not really mentioned in actual words what the methods are that have been used. You've kind of hinted at them, the fact that there's humour used, there's respect, there's rhetorical questions, and some of the other language that's been used, but you need to actually be more explicit and actually state what the methods are that have been used to gain higher marks for this question. The next bullet point says select some appropriate textual detail and references. Again, you've done that, and again, yes, you've identified some different ideas and perspectives. So I think really we need to stick at level 2 because of this lack of much comment on how the writer's methods are used. So I think it's worth probably about 7 out of the 8 marks there, which is 7 out of the possible 16 marks overall. To gain higher marks, you could have talked about how Jay views parenting, and you could have said that he's quite informal, friendly way of parenting. He tries to help Eddie. He doesn't force him to do anything, and they have quite a friendly relationship. But he still does value the education that Eddie's receiving, and he's quite proud when he gets his results. Whereas Henry's dad, you've given quite detailed interpretation of how he views parenting, but not his views and perspective on education. It actually says in the text, "I do not approve of the system of education, for they do not appear to have improved." And he goes on to say that when they left home they could spell, but he spotted some spelling mistakes in Henry's letter. And that, together with some more detailed comments on how the writer's methods are used, would have gained you band 3, heading up into band 4. Overall, that gives you 21 out of 40 for this mock exam, which, considering it's the first attempt that we've made at this, it's a really good score, and we've still got 5 months to work on the areas that you need to improve on. So you shouldn't have any worries about being able to gain a good mark in your GCSE. Keep up the good work, keep up the 100% attendance and the 100% handing your homework in, because it is clearly having a good effect on you. Well done.